to make Diane Hosfelt talking about mixed reality security here. Well,
bear with me for like 1 second while I make sure that my notifications are off, because you know it's really annoying having your wrist vibrate during your entire talk. Okay, so hi, I'm Diane, and I make a lot of mistakes, right? I've used terrible passwords, and then I've reused those same terrible passwords. I snoozed my system updates for months. Let's see, it took me longer than I would like to admit to start using a password manager. I accidentally DDoSed a critical production server once, and this is my greatest accomplishment to date. One time, I uninstalled Java from my computer and then managed to convince my computer that I hadn't actually uninstalled it, which was a really, really fun experience debugging that. But here's the great thing about mistakes, right? We get to learn from them. And the most important mistake that we all make is we don't actually ever learn from them. Each time a shiny new technology appears, we seem to divide into factions. On the one side, we have the group that's like really excited, we only see the benefits, and we race forward and we're like, you know what, we'll get to privacy and security later. And here's a hint, like, they don't. And then we have the other side, and that's a bunch of people, you know, the so-called privacy and security experts saying, well, you know, you'll never reach the full potential of this technology until we have privacy and security. And the thing is, we're not going to wait for privacy and security to happen. Okay, so before I wax poetic on that, right? Let's talk about a few IoT fails that have happened recently. And by recently, I mean in the last few years. So first, we have the Mirai botnet, where an IoT botnet gets to take down one of the main DNS companies by sending network requests from your connected fridges, DVD players, cameras, etc. We also had the really fun experience of discovering that our cardiac devices are super hackable. No one needs a working heart, right? Then, you know what's a great idea? Having a home security camera send all of your login credentials via plain text. What could go wrong? And this one's not a problem at all. You can remotely take control of a car and control its acceleration and braking too. So everything is totally fine, everyone. We are roughly a decade into, sorry, I forgot about my animations. Love animations. You can write that down. I'm a very animated speaker. All right, so we're roughly a decade into IoT, and the very first IoT device that I could find in my research on the internet was a toaster that you could turn on and off via the internet, and that was back in 1990. Now, I'm pretty sure that we still have toasters that we can turn on and off via the internet, but let's be honest, I'm not very good with technology. I would never be able to manage that. We've been using the term Internet of Things since about 1999, and we say that the Internet of Things was born about 10 years ago in 2008, 2009, when the number of devices connected to the internet exceeded the number of people. So why am I here then? Well, I really wanted to visit New Zealand, and I spent the last week going to Hobbiton and touring the west coast of the South Island, and it's lovely. I understand why no one really wants to leave. Also, it's a very long flight. But a bit more on topic. With the Internet of Things, we've been inviting technology into our lives more and more. Our kitchen appliances are connected to the internet. Our doorbells are connected to the internet. Our cars, and soon, our heads. Maybe not quite, but realistically, you know, I already feel like my phone is an extension of myself. And when I put on a connected headset, right, like I am literally connecting my head to the internet, which is, luckily right now we can also just take it right back off. But, you know, sometimes people do crazy things like getting weird tech implants. And it's not that hard to imagine a future where we can't take our headsets off. And IoT has begun to shape our lives differently. We don't just program computers, we program our homes, we program our experiences. And we're always playing catch up with security and privacy. I don't know if it's that we haven't fully appreciated the consequences of the large-scale data collection that's become commonplace, or if we just neglect privacy and security in the name of expediency. But I don't really want to always feel like I'm behind. I want to be proactive about privacy and security, and I want to look at what we've learned from the most recent time we decided to stuff our lives with tech and see what can we do less wrong. I'm not going to say better because, well, I'm a security person. That sounds far too optimistic. So first, I'll talk about what mixed reality is, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges that we face with security and privacy in this space. Then I'll talk about a little bit about what we can do to be more proactive and why we should bother. Lesson number 1. We need privacy by design. If we don't start with it, we don't end with it. And in the middle, it's not like it magically appears. We need to think about privacy by default. The way we've been developing hasn't really been working. We build with scalability and performance in mind, and hopefully we're also thinking about usability, but we need to add privacy to that list of initial design requirements. And this is also when we get my first hot take of the day. And that's a few general statements about privacy today, right? 1, we need to evolve our ideas of data ownership and protection. Who owns the data that you generate in VR? Is it you? Is it the device manufacturer? Is it the application? What if this data is a map of your home? What happens when you move away? I would love to stand up here and tell you what all of the answers are. And I could probably do like a decent approximation of the tour guide where I just make them up. And I sound so confident that you believe me. But mostly right now, I'm just asking questions. That's pretty much what I've been doing for the past few months, is asking a lot of questions. And my second hot take is that our current app and web permissions model is insufficient. We divide permissions into 2 buckets: dangerous, not dangerous. We require explicit consent for the, was this the hand that I used for dangerous? Okay, so explicit permission for the dangerous ones. And then the not dangerous ones, we're like, all right, have it, like do whatever you want, we're good. But it's not clear that the not dangerous permissions are in fact not dangerous. And in fact, we know that interactions between them are in fact dangerous. And I'll revisit this later. But the reason I bring this up is that the easiest option for like an augmented reality permission is to just ask for continuous camera access. And weirdly enough, that is not the most privacy conscious approach. So from there, I started thinking much more deeply about permissions. What am I consenting to? What is informed consent, and how can we first inform and secondly obtain consent? What makes a permission useful? How can we balance informed user consent with permission fatigue? And this is some ongoing work. But as I talk more about the sensors that enable mixed reality experiences, That's something that I like to keep in mind. So what is mixed reality? It encompasses both virtual and augmented reality. Sorry. Mixed reality devices sense the real world. They do real-time processing. They are mobile or wearable. And they output information to the user, whether that's by visual, audio, or haptic means. And that information can be overlaid on the user's perception of the physical world or a completely virtual world. So the devices recognize and track physical world objects. I try not to say real world because like what is real? And then I go into like this philosophical existential crisis. And then you would just see me like off in a corner hugging my brownie. So these physical world objects that we're tracking, it's not just the world around us. It's also ourselves, like tracking things like the user's gaze and movement. So I have some examples of mixed reality devices up here. Okay, that's a different side. So that one is the Magic Leap 1, and the other one is the Oculus Go, if you are not familiar with them. Bringing virtual elements into the physical world, adding in immersion, taking a dash of always-on sensors, it introduces some unique considerations. So what I'm going to talk about now is new methods of harassment. Yay! Physical security concerns. Woo! Biometric and physical world data and how things are shifting now. So let's get into harassment, shall we? Sometimes it's really depressing work. You just have to smile. We all know that we can't have nice things. IoT offered plenty of harassment vectors, notably in domestic violence situations. Imagine if your ex could remotely monitor each time you opened your door or like lock your door on you or do all sorts of crazy things like make your house suddenly 100 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously. Celsius would be a little extreme. But social mixed reality experiences are really promising. It's not just because I can have virtual meetings with my boss at Hogwarts, which yes, I have done, but they make the world a smaller place. It's easier to keep in touch with remote friends and family. It can provide access to education and healthcare in underserved areas. But again, we cannot have nice things. People immediately started using these experiences to harass others. In 2016, we have a woman named Jordan Bellomeyer who wrote about her experiences being sexually harassed in a Steam VR game called Quiver. The developers responded by implementing a personal bubble, which is a great step. Although it is still very weird when you have a bubble around yourself and someone goes from there to like all of a sudden they kind of jumps time and space and appear over there. That can be a little disconcerting. Jessica Outlaw, a researcher at the Extended Mind, ran a study on the experiences of women in social VR experiences. And she found that after 30 minutes, most of the participants reported feeling unsafe. So this isn't hypothesis, like harassment's already happening and it's already really quite bad for non-men. And digital harassment, of course, is nothing new, but the immersive environment provides perpetrators with more power over their targets, and correspondingly, we need to provide strong safeguards. Personal bubbles, muting and blocking need to be obvious and easy to find on menus. One of the problems in Jessica Outlaw's study was that the women couldn't figure out how to easily block someone. It was not obvious. Another application of augmented reality is anchoring virtual objects. I know you all just came here because I put a poop emoji in my abstract. But we can anchor virtual objects to a physical location. Maybe anyone with a device can see it, but maybe designate just some certain subset group that can view it. This would be really cool. Like maybe there's some awesome geocaching possibilities. There's some very powerful possibilities for disseminating political ideas. But it's also a really good avenue for virtual graffiti. Maybe somebody really hates my talk after this and they're like, you know what? I'm gonna go and anchor a poop emoji outside Diane's house and she's going to know how strongly I disagree with her opinions on the internet. And the good news is that it should be easier to delete virtual graffiti than clean real graffiti. The bad news is that thanks to anonymity, God, sorry, I'm really happy I said that word right, on the internet, it could be really difficult to determine who is doing this harassment, right? That's not great. And this brings me to lesson 2. There will be malicious actors and we must plan for it. This could be a data breach. Maybe somebody hacks your application to try and access the rest of the device or the rest of the network. Maybe it's racial slurs or bullying. And in a mixed reality context, these problems can have, like, I'm not minimizing the physical security impact that like cyberbullying and such have today, but they can be much more physical, much quicker in an immersive environment. And to start us off with physical security, I want to talk a little bit about IoT and healthcare. Sadly, technology that could have helped us debias healthcare ended up neglecting half the population. I'll give you 2 guesses which half of the population it was. It took almost a year for Apple Health to track essential components of women's health. And when they did implement that, did they do a good job? No, they did not. And did the apps that appeared to fill the void do a good job? The answer is also not really. I have pointers if you want follow-ups. But even worse, connected healthcare devices follow really terrible security practices. 2 patients in Austria, they're hooked up to pumps to manage their pain medication, right? Like, seems normal. It's delivered, it's connected, everything's great. They wanted more pain meds, as we all do. And they found some hard-coded credentials online, and they upped their doses. You know what happens when you up your dose of pain meds? You overdose and have respiratory issues. So that happened. And then in June 2015, malware compromised blood gas analyzers. Now, you're like, oh, but what are they really going to do with blood gas data? Like, what even is that? But they then hopped into the rest of the hospital's network and stole a bunch of confidential medical data. I'm not even going to get into how insurance companies try to use IoT-derived data to deny healthcare in places like the US, because don't worry, I'll get to it eventually. Just not right now, we're depressed enough. So we already have examples of digital assault. Probably the most egregious example is hacking a website for epileptics in an attempt to induce seizures. I'm not sure why you would do that, but people have. And an important distinction here is that mixed reality experiences overlay information on the physical world, whether it's by total immersion or incorporating virtual objects into the physical world. Aside from questions of legal liabilities, this technology provides vectors for virtual attacks that affect us physically. We have other examples where we can contribute to illegal discrimination. Mixed reality experiences could provide us with information we shouldn't have or can't legally use. One application is interviewing, right? I need to interview someone, say they're in New Zealand because it's in the middle of nowhere, and they're like, I don't want to fly 36 hours to where you are. So we hop in, I'm in a virtual interview space with them, and my device uses nonverbal cues to deduce whether this candidate has autism or ADHD or what their sexual orientation is. And then, like, now that I have that information, is my decision to hire or not biased by this? Like, it's a huge liability, and really it's completely unethical. We also have a lot of applications coming out in driving and cars. Auto manufacturers want to enhance the information to help drivers be better drivers because we're terrible drivers. Well, what happens if your technology obscures a road sign, whether it's by accident or because a malicious actor has hacked the application, right? Like, someone could die from that. Or what if, for some reason, there's an augmented reality pop-up when you're driving and, like, you cause an accident because you're like, oh my God, what is that? Some other things that people get excited about is, oh, you know what I've always wanted to do? Go mushroom foraging. But, like, I can't tell mushroom A from mushroom B. Like, I don't know anything about them. So I'm like, all right, let me go. And I'm going to take my phone and I'm going to be like, is this mushroom safe to eat? Yes. And then, like, 2 minutes later, dead. I don't know how long it takes a mushroom to kill you. But, right, like, these are serious questions that we need to think about. And then, of course, we have digital stalking, which can take, like, yes, it happens now, but it can take new and exciting forms. For example, you can post an avatar of yourself outside of, like, your ex's house, or, like, follow them around constantly. It's like, because our avatars could become extensions of ourselves, we don't have a framework to express that. In particular, we don't have a framework legally to express that. And one thing that people have found, that lawyers have found, is in restraining orders, like, how do we cover things like this, things that happen in a virtual world? How do we, like, do we have to state manually, like, hey, you can't touch any of the thermostats in your former residence because they have a restraining order against you? And these are really difficult problems of law, policy, technology, society. Now, I can stand up here and say, maybe we should all just not be jerks, which is a great step one, but obviously insufficient. Even without all of these extreme, yet plausible scenarios, it's not uncommon for people to experience cyber sickness. It is apparently a word. It has a Wikipedia page. Did not know that it had its own word until recently. It's basically motion sickness from VR. Headache, disorientation, drowsiness, fatigue, vomiting. We don't really know what causes it exactly, but we do know that the images that are presented to a person in a virtual environment have a very strong impact. And this is, the frame rate and the resolution can be modified to alleviate cyber sickness or make it worse. So these considerations are not limited to mixed reality head-mount displays. We also have the introduction and use of powerful extended duration sensors on AR-enabled handsets, like my phone. And that means that they share many of the same privacy concerns. So first, let's talk about, apparently we're talking about world data first. Sorry, my notes are out of order. In order to compose a 3D scene, we have to gather information about the physical space occupied by the user. For a virtual experience, the devices need to be able to tell you if you're about to walk into a wall, which is apparently not something they want you to do. They also need to know your height so that you can do things like pick something up off the floor. It turns out that it is incredibly frustrating when you are playing a game and the object that you need to pick up is, like, far below your feet. That has happened to me far too many times. Still makes me a little angry. But then for augmented reality, we get to add some more concerns. At the lowest level, so we need to define some sort of levels for world access on the immersive web. At the lowest level, we provide no world data to a web page unless the browser can then composite the virtual information received from the page onto the user's view of the physical world. We would end up having really poorly placed content. It's not clear if the distinction between allowing the browser to have full camera access versus the web page having full camera access is clear, useful, easily conveyed. I don't really know what the answer to that one is. The next level is to provide some sort of limited access. And at first we thought, well, let's just do rate-limited hit testing. So we send a ray out in space, we get information back about what's happening. And we rate limit it so that you can only get information about a certain amount of space. However, a malicious actor could, of course, just send out random rays in space. And even with rate limiting, it would take a reasonable amount of time for them to recover a useful world view. So what we ended up doing, and I believe that this is the current approach, is we limit the world access to some diameter around the user or some diameter around the object that the person is trying to interact with. That way we limit the space, but we also don't end up sending hit tests all over the place. Then we have world geometry. This gives the web page the access to the mesh of planes that forms the 3D scene. And this allows it to appropriately interact with physical world surfaces. Finally, we can just give the web page access to the camera. This is the most intrusive permission level. Some people are definitely leaning towards it as the default, and it should not be the default. With world data, we also have concerns about bystander privacy and a tension between the ideas of public and private space. Then we have super exciting gait analysis. It turns out that the way that you move in a virtual world is a pretty unique signature. Modeling this can create a fingerprint to track you even across completely disjoint virtual identities. So talking about movement a little bit, by continuously recording and analyzing the physical world in near real time, right, there's a lot of biometrics we can extract. At a minimum, you need 3 degrees of freedom to do anything useful in a virtual space. And that's just your basic head orientation, tilting, turning your head, and moving. Yeah, that. And then more sophisticated devices use 6 degrees of freedom. So that takes the previous 3, and then it adds in movement like left, right, up, down, and forward and back. So basically me pacing around while I talk. And all of these can identify you. And then we add in gaze tracking. It's super useful, right? We can use gaze tracking to allow you to just use your gaze to navigate a scene. But we can also do things like use your pupil dilation to try and guess at your sexual orientation. And as I mentioned before, tracking your eyes, how you interact with the virtual world, does actually reveal things like autism and ADHD, and potentially other things like anxiety and such. This has been studied for diagnosis on the healthcare side, and it's not as we've seen, the protections afforded to health data in the hands of a healthcare company. When we then move over to a technology company, those mysteriously disappear. And of course, I'm talking about 23andMe, which has the interesting distinction of not only making like you, the user, the product, but also making you pay for the privilege of becoming the product. And along that lines, biometrics are very powerful. We can't change them. Once that information is out, we can't claw it back. So in order, right. Ooh, yes, side channels. Sorry, love this one. Okay, so with all of these sensors required for comfortable immersion, there is a new problem of unintended information leakage. I have up here a bunch of sensors. Oh, no, why does that always happen? Let's try this again. Okay. All right, so the previous examples are examples of intentional information disclosure. In security jargon, we call that a side channel. When we first started discussing them in the crypto community, we were looking at things like execution times and power consumption when we watch these side channels, these unintended leaks, we can then extract secret keys and everything's bad and everything's terrible. Well, now it gets worse because you know how you have an accelerometer in your phone because Pokemon Go needs to know if you're driving when you're playing it? Well, guess what? You can also use accelerometer data to derive someone's PIN. All it takes is a malicious app running at the same time as you unlocking your phone, and then we can add in some more data from the, did I not put that on there? The oscilloscope or something, and we can further refine our guesses. It's great. Right, this is the point in the conversation where I look out and I generally see terror in people's eyes. If I could get some terror going on here. And I used to hear the same thing over and over when I talk to people. Why do I care? I have nothing to hide. Over the past few years, there has been a shift, and that is probably the only thing that brings me optimism. We've seen massive data breaches. We've watched our elections be manipulated. We've had our refrigerators DDoS us. It's not that people don't care anymore. It's that they didn't know that they needed to care. And part of our job as technologists is to empower them and ourselves and our users. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we need to do is identify potential risks. And then we need to talk about them, which is like why I'm here, right? Talking to everyone about them. In particular, there's tension between how we can provide accessibility features like using gaze tracking to navigate a scene. Like that's a very powerful thing to say for someone who doesn't have the use of their limbs. But how can we give people these accessibility features without asking them to compromise their security and their privacy? This year, I will be working on experiments around permissions and data collection in the space to try to motivate what I'll do next year or the year after. I don't know. But we're collaborating on specifications and working groups. And I can say that Firefox Reality, while we are developing it, while we are working on the WebXR specification, we are thinking about privacy. We are talking about it. It is not an afterthought for us. And what I want to say about that is that your privacy is fundamental. The first privacy law that I'm aware of is from 14th century England. It's called the Justices of the Peace Act, and it says that peeping toms and eavesdroppers can be arrested. Fast forward a few centuries, and we have the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which also enshrines privacy as a fundamental human right. In practice, we often fall short of these declarations. Data protection laws, government surveillance, and workplace surveillance regulations have all failed to evolve in a way that meaningfully protects privacy. Which brings me to lesson 3. When people feel hopeless about their privacy, they don't see the point in trying. When we show them how they can concretely improve, their security posture without putting on a tinfoil hat, if I go all dystopian on someone, they're just going to think I'm crazy. They would not be wrong, but it's not going to help. We need to identify ways to effectively communicate risks, trade-offs, and mitigations. So how can we empower ourselves as users and as developers? First thing, oh, this is my cat Watson. Yeah. First thing, ask questions. I recently went to a virtual reality art installation. And because I'm that person, I went around asking a bunch of questions about, well, what data are you collecting? What are you going to do with it? Are you storing it here? Are you sending it off somewhere to be analyzed? Like, what's your age off period? And it took me a little while to find someone who knew any of the things I was asking about, but they engaged. And I think that it's a very powerful way to communicate. Like, art is a good way to communicate these things with people, and it was a great installation. We need to prioritize privacy, both as users and developers. As a user, it's hard when your only option is to grant an application more permissions than you feel are necessary. You're presented with a list of things, you accept it and get to use it, or you don't accept it and you don't get to use it. Sure, I can say use a more privacy-preserving option, but there might not be one, or you might have to pay for it. And you might not be able to. You shouldn't have to be wealthy to afford privacy. And developers also ask questions. That's like kind of a theme here. Like, asking questions is good. Why do you need this data? Why are you collecting it? How are you storing it? Would you be satisfied with your protections if you were a user? Have empathy. People who are going to use what you create are not going to look like you. So how would a malicious user use what you've created to try to hurt someone? Does your product work on someone with darker skin than you? Not always. And like things like, can your creation be used by companies to deny people fundamental rights like healthcare? In the US, some CPAP machines, which are used to treat sleep apnea, they actually transmit data that health insurance providers can then use to determine non-compliance. And if you are a non-compliant patient, guess what you don't get? A new CPAP machine. The legal system isn't equipped to handle the rate at which technology is evolving. If we look at Australia's new encryption legislation, yay! They cited the challenges posed by ubiquitous encryption as a motivation. Instead of attempting to circumvent mathematics, shouldn't our governments be mandating technologies that safeguard privacy and security? And something that I've noticed is that usually the language of these bills, people don't, the legislators don't understand the fundamental things about the technology that they are then trying to regulate. We need to engage more. As people, we need to call them and be like, hey, do better. As developers, we need to help them understand how they can do better. The market is not going to wait for us to figure out security and privacy. The internet didn't wait, IoT didn't wait, neither will this. So let's work on it now. Now, one problem with professionally thinking about all of the ways things can go wrong and being long-winded about it and running out of time is I never motivate why we should care. So now let's talk quickly about some awesome things you can do with mixed reality. Right, so this is Snow World. 1996, researchers at University of Washington developed Snow World. Basically, what happens is usually we use opiates to treat burn patients, and that's pretty good, except for when we need to do any wound care on them. And then 86% of them report having severe or excruciating pain even with their painkillers. Well, turns out that what you can do is you can take the patient's attention off of the pain by redirecting it into this lovely, cool, very cool virtual world, and you can direct them towards thinking about the exploration of it, and it did actually improve their pain. And by improve, I mean decrease it. Yeah, and they showed a drastic reduction in pain. There's also a lot of potential with accessibility. It can provide new experiences to people who are bedridden or in the hospital. It can enable virtual visits from friends and family who can't travel. I mentioned an application of gaze tracking for people who can't use their limbs to navigate, like the web. We can also do things like design interfaces where like you select which of your limbs work, and then the device figures out how to make things work for whatever number of limbs you have. I don't know if we should like add limbs or anything, but sorry. Just for fun. We can also do things like improving navigation by providing haptic feedback for people who are blind, visually impaired, hearing impaired, right? If like you get like a warning on one side that a car is coming, that could be really, really helpful. We can also use it to safely train people for dangerous activities. Like last week, I went to Milford Sound. Captain of my boat was like, you know, it'd be awesome using VR to introduce people to, you know, the area that we're going to be diving. Wouldn't that be awesome? Or, you know, combat, right? Like, weirdly enough, it is not safe to train people in combat by throwing them into combat. Lesson learned. Perhaps most importantly, this is a new communications medium. Remember how the internet revolutionized how we communicate? Mixed reality has similar potential. It can bring us closer to each other than ever before. And it can give people who wouldn't otherwise be able to travel the freedom to be present anywhere in the world instantaneously. It allows us to choose how we want to be represented in the world. I can finally realize my dream of being a cat in real life. And it provides us with new ways to explore our identities and our relationship with the world around us. Which brings me to the last lesson, which is that we still have all of our previous challenges. The web is complicated. Moving from 2 dimensions to 3 doesn't solve anything. It just gives us new problems and new questions. Authentication is hard. Identity is hard. Passwords are hard. Passwords in VR, much harder. But it also provides new opportunities like using a 3D visual password scheme. And so this is a pivotal stage for mixed reality privacy. It's awesome, really it is. It's time to think past gaming and realize how revolutionary the technology really can be. The flip side is we often don't recognize the potential risks of emerging technology because we're so focused on the awesomeness. And then we've already set a suboptimal course. So any solution to our privacy woes is going to require cohesion between technology, society, and the law. Your privacy is fundamental, and I really do hope that we can examine the mistakes we've made in the past and chart a better and more privacy-conscious course for emerging technologies. We need to ask ourselves, how can we build platforms and applications that will be private and secure by default? How can we incentivize privacy more generally? Can we have privacy-preserving advertising? How can platforms act as a privacy-preserving user agent? Like, can we, the browser, take an image that you want to transmit, detect that you have a prescription or some other confidential data in the scene, and can we just not send that part so that we aren't leaking your medical data all over the place? Maybe. And yeah, it's exciting. We can do better. We really can. Questions? Okay, so the question, if I understand it, was even if we handle these things at a browser level, there are still layers below that that are used to gather the data. And does Mozilla have a plan for that? Firstly, I am not going to speak for Mozilla on this subject. But the thing is that over time, more manufacturers come in. Hopefully it won't always be Oculus and Facebook. So yes, right now, like our chain of trust is definitely compromised in who is building these things and how it's being collected. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still try to be a user agent that is active on behalf of people.
So we really know what to talk. We've got a 10-minute break, so maybe you'll hang around.
I will hang around for a few minutes because I talk too much.
Thank you very much.